Hello, my name's Bill Mew.
And I'm Des Blanchfield.
I'm just recently back from Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, which I was covering live from the event. And Des, you were covering it remotely from our studio in Australia. It was a great event. I believe that you were there in person last year, whilst I covered it from the studio. So it was my turn this year. What were the main highlights that you saw from the event, the things that really came home to you?
So I'll probably just summarize our sort of three highlights that we did at the end of day 1, 2, and 3, and then we can sort of delve into some of the detail. But it was interesting to see growth in the 4 years from now startup conference, where countries are sponsoring their startups to come to the event and show what they have on offer. It was interesting to see a lot of new focus on what I would normally call consumer devices. An interesting thing where somebody had made a fold phone out of chocolate and took a bite out of it, which was quite visually interesting. Transparent laptops, a flying, drone again, one of those quadcopter things, and a device manufacturer with a car. So there's a few things like that we'll delve into in a minute. But the other thing that really jumped out, which we also highlight in our 3 daily end-of-day wrap-up highlights videos through the week, was the obvious focus on artificial intelligence and AI and how that is now essentially being integrated into everything. And I guess just to quickly sum up, the thing that really struck me was there was less focus on the infrastructure side of things. So, router, switches, servers, data center infrastructure. There was still a lot of talk about cloud, but a lot of it was about the adoption of public cloud, not so much telco cloud. So compared to last year, where I feel, and perhaps it was, as we were speaking offline earlier, it was, sort of coming back from the lockdown periods where people sort of went back into their normal format. For the first year out of the lockdowns, the event was sort of into its normal format of, telco focus, mobile infrastructure focus, and trying to get back on top of where 5G deployments were. But this year was very, very different in my mind, remotely watching and trolling it in many ways. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on what it was like on the ground there. But that was just my general thoughts at high level, which we can delve into soon. It was a new, interesting feel. I like it. I'm not against it. It had, as I said in one of our daily wrap-ups, a bit of a CES type thing around consumer devices and integration into that. I think that's an exciting place to go. And I know we're going to delve into that a little more, but what was your sense on the ground through the week?
Well, from my perspective, first of all, it was a massive event, and it's great to see the fact that it's back to its full capacity. I think they were even struggling with catering at one point, and I think we were talking about the region of 95,000 people there. So very much a return to form, which is enormously welcome. Seeing the fact that it's bounced back since the pandemic and all the restrictions that we had back then. The other thing was there were some discussions about some pretty deep, important industry-wide topics around collaborations on APIs, looking at the spectrum, things that were common to the whole industry that they come together to discuss. But there was a very limited amount of major announcements by the individual operators and technology leaders. I think many were possibly concerned that anything they did announce would be drowned in the noise that you get at a Mobile World Congress. But in the absence of some really groundbreaking and that major announcements by a lot of the players, I think there was a general theme. And the theme was around IoT and enhanced IoT, and we were seeing cars and other devices that were on display. We were looking at an increased focus on the mobile connectivity to support not only IoT, but also the element in the room, which is AI. And there was enormous discussion around a lot of the application of these technologies. We saw some very senior figures from many of the players. I mean, I saw Brad Smith on the Microsoft stand, Michael Dell was there, a whole host of different people. But it was good, really, from my perspective, to see a real return to form for the event itself.
Indeed, and I guess in many ways that sort of speaks to what I was talking about a moment ago, and that is that the Microsofts and the Dells and so forth. These are brands that are at infrastructure level, but they are for the bulk of things considered consumer device level thing. So I like this idea that now we're seeing cross-pollination between what would be the consumer interface into the telecommunications space and the infrastructure side of things. We did actually have an interesting conversation, I think it was on day 2, and I'd like to just get your take on this as well, around the challenge that licensing of spectrum presents. And we did sort of touch on this, but to summarize that for our audience today, there's an issue of just the continual access to spectrum for not just 5G, but obviously 5.5 as it comes out, the next revision of the 3GPP standard, and then eventually 6G and so forth. We've got regions like North America where a lot of the spectrum was tied up very early on by military uses, whether it was in use or not, it was just locked up. We had other regions such as Europe and Asia operating in different spaces. We've got nations that are necessarily having to use spectrum licensing to generate revenue to support their GDP. And then we've got other nations where it's really just being handed out. They want to use that as a way to drive innovation and technology adoption. I'm keen to get your thoughts on what you saw announced, and then I'd like to circle back on that with a couple of thoughts on that, just around the challenge of spectrum licensing and the regulatory compliance and governance around the use of the available licensed spectrum space.
Obviously, from my perspective, we have a limited amount of spectrum, and therefore it's largely down to the government and the regulators how that's handed out. Many governments see this as a great opportunity for them to do a certain amount of financial grab in terms of charging an enormous amount for licenses. I think many cash-strapped governments see that as a great opportunity. For those governments that actually are keener to give away licenses or sell them cheap to try to foster innovation, I think there's a lot to be said. From my perspective, though, that once the spectrum has been allocated or sold, it's very much down to the most efficient use of the spectrum. And this comes back down to a lot of the advances that have been made in optimizing some of these technologies. And I saw a lot of talk about moving from 5G to 5.5G. And I had some enhanced discussions with Huawei, who are doing a lot in this space. And in fact, talking about optimization, Huawei won one of the GSMA GLOMO Awards for Best Network Infrastructure Product for the green series of antenna that they have, which are very much focused on absolutely making the most of the spectrum and minimizing the amount of energy consumption. Because again, another theme here was green, and there's a great awareness that organizations need to be a great more efficient, not only in their spectrum usage, but also in their energy usage.
Indeed, and I'd like to circle back to another announcement that you were at in person that came from Huawei with regard to a new cloud and telco, or rather telco cloud database platform. Before we get into that, I want to just close up on the spectrum thing. I think there are significant challenges in different parts of the world. In North America, you've got this large tract of land with populations spread across that large, area of America or United States, as they call themselves, where there's high density populations in towns and cities, but there's big areas that are rural with almost no coverage. And then you've got the other side of the planet. You've got places like Indonesia with 14 or 15,000 islands, 6,000 or 7,000 that are relatively well populated, and other 2 or 3 islands that are just so densely populated. They're some of the largest populations and cities in the world. So there's some big differences between how those two areas address the challenge of spectrum. Then you've got Australia, essentially the 5th or 6th largest piece of dirt on the planet, with only 26 million people on the coastline. And again, some of the largest distances to be covered getting telco infrastructure interconnected. And then we've got New Zealand on the other end of the spectrum, if you'll pardon the pun, where it's a fairly small area, very small population, but again, very large distances between those populations. So there's some engineering technical challenge there, and then also, I guess, there's some need for them to generate revenue. But I think we're going to see a significant increase in cross-pollination across networks, collaboration, as you inferred earlier, where networks are going to have to share space, share spectrum, and maybe even do essentially what we do in the TCP/IP and IP address space, where blocks of IP is allocated to individual organizations and networks, but they may route between each other, which we're seeing with different carriers in the past do that. But let's get back to something you mentioned earlier, which was some announcements from Huawei. I was quite interested to get your take on their telco cloud database platform and some of the performance success stories they had there.
Okay, this lends to one of the major peripheral areas that were focused on at Mobile World Congress. Obviously, whilst telco and mobile are the main areas of focus, all of these go hand in hand with cloud, IoT, AI, and many of these areas we're seeing a real emergence of some competitors to the cloud giants. We've seen domination by the big three hyperscalers, and with the challenges from the likes of Oracle and IBM, which have been of questionable success. We're also seeing some major giants from China. We've got Ali, we've got Huawei, also entering the cloud space in a big way. And in Europe, we've got the GAIX consortium, which has been struggling actually to provide any sort of challenging proposition to the cloud giants. It's interesting in some of the innovations I saw from Huawei around their new Gauss DB initiative, very much focused on providing the infrastructure both in DB and also in cloud for the major infrastructure challenges, so dealing at massive scale. I think this will be a major challenge certainly for the likes of Oracle, who have led with cloud on the DB side because of their heritage. But it'll be interesting to see how some of this plays out. From my perspective, all of these technologies go hand in hand, and therefore we're not going to see a single player dominate right away across the spectrum. It's a question of actually intelligent collaboration and working together to deliver. And you've got specialists in each area, from 5.5G to cloud to AI, and it's the way that individual carriers and players bring some of these technologies together that's actually going to really deliver value to the client.
Indeed, and when you mention the GAUS or GAUS, as I would call it, DB, one of the things that jumped out at me watching the announcement live was a combination of things: the readiness for AI in high availability, up to 1,000 nodes per cluster, fault redundancy and resilience, the source code level security that was built in, and a range of other things. Focus on what I would call next generation infrastructure, software-defined infrastructure in the telco cloud space, where intelligent routing is done within the network, not necessarily the physical devices, and that some smart agents are now being used within the network to self-deploy into these environments requiring database and storage environments. I'm keen to get your take on how you felt there on the ground. It seemed very, very heavily focused on from a topic point of view, artificial intelligence as a whole. But what I didn't see was real practical examples. There was a lot of conversation at 30,000 foot level about how companies were planning to deploy it, roll it out, leverage it. Did you see any real practical, real world implementations? I know you went to interview Leonard Donnelly and the CEO of Waylay. You also met the chief operating officer and founder and had them on camera, and you saw some live demos there of artificial intelligence in play. But what practical examples did you see on the ground through the week where AI was not just being discussed and talked about from a future point of view, but actually was in play in real terms now?
A lot of this comes back to what I was talking about, this being an ecosystem play, with the carriers providing the infrastructure, the 5.5G, some of the cloud support in order to enable players such as Waylay to provide the actionable intelligence to enable automation and to address a lot of the challenges that clients face. But when you get down to the client level, there actually has to be a real application of AI. And I certainly feel, and a lot of my discussions with the likes of the UK government and other players in this regard, they're still trying to find or trying to decide exactly how they're going to deploy AI. It's all very well having chatbots and other different things that can do a limited amount, but we've yet to see the truly intelligent AI, and actually to have that integrated into a lot of solutions. Now, we were seeing demos all over the place with some clever tricks in terms of inserting people into imaginary scenarios and whatever. and we were seeing scenarios that could play out in health and in many other spectrums and supporting areas like farming, where you have an enormous proliferation of IoT devices. I think a lot of those are going to start to become a reality, and a lot of discussions I was having with Huawei about the fact that they've been talking about 5.5G for about 3 years now, but really now we're starting to see the networks being stress tested and deployed, and the testing happening on the ground to ensure that the sort of bandwidth, the reliability, the low latency, the enhanced IoT support are all available on the ground. But again, it's going to take a short while before people on the ground, the clients, the customers, are going to actually have solutions that really are able to leverage these technologies to the full. We're going to see them, and I certainly see that we'll see a lot of progress this year, and I look forward possibly to going back to Mobile World Congress next year, having seen some real implementations and demonstrations of the technologies, because I think there's undoubtedly real potential here, and I think we're on the verge of a real step forward. A lot of the pieces are in place, but I think certainly from what I'm talking to, let's say again with the UK government and others, they're yet to actually have a clear idea or a clear strategy about how they're going to be using AI. And if they haven't got that idea yet, it's going to take them a short while to actually put the technologies in place to integrate them and to sort of deliver AI-enabled services. So I think we're going to need to wait a short while. There will be isolated use cases where we see a proof of concept and other different things, but I think we're still a little way out yet.
Indeed. Another observation I'd love us to just delve into. We're used to seeing the big brands of Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia. We're used to seeing sort of second-tier brands of handsets. We'll come back to the other topic around, human-sized drones that we can fly around the city and cars appearing, and the fun of having transparent laptops. But one of the things I did observe, and again, I'd like us to go back and forth on this, is the continued emergence of the likes of Tata Communications, HCL, Wipro, Infosys, Tech Mahindra, service delivery orientated organizations who are coming from the design and consulting point of view, helping organizations do things like design smarter networks, deploy private networks, and particularly private 5G infrastructure. Here in Australia, for example, we have mining environments deploying private 5G networks. We have manufacturing plants, very big infrastructure. We've certainly got retail operators and their distribution centers and their warehouses, and now moving some of that infrastructure into the actual resale centers themselves, into the giant stores. And in one in particular, that I won't name, but they don't need free promo, but one group here in Australia in the retail space that have 5 different brands under their umbrella, now converting all their stores that are very, very large department-sized stores environments, essentially into warehouses that you shop at. And they're looking at shutting down their warehouse facility to go from distribution directly to the stores and fulfill from the stores, both outward bound fulfillment and reverse fulfillment for returns. And a lot of those brands that may not have typically been seen as telco players, particularly Tata Communications, and I know Waylay told you they were talking about some stuff they're doing there. There's new emerging activity in this space where I think large enterprise players are maybe not going to the traditional telco operators, the telco players or the carriers, looking for some of that professional services and consulting. I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this, and maybe you can go backwards and forwards on why this might be happening and what it actually means.
I think undoubtedly we've already seen private 5G networks, and I think as we move to 5.5G, we're going to see a far wider proliferation of private networks supporting value propositions that individual organizations have. But again, a lot of this comes down to what are the inherent advantages that we're looking for from 5.5G. And that is a reduction in latency, which will actually make a lot of these private networks and the applications they're trying to support more practical, enhanced support for IoT devices, which again will provide a far greater opportunity for these technologies to be exploited in this way. But also we're looking at reliability, and this comes after we saw one major telco in the US having the embarrassing situation where it had a major outage and actually had to to tell its customers that in the event of emergency, they should try using somebody else's network, which is a slightly stark reminder that above all of this sort of innovation and the enhanced value proposition that we're looking at, fundamentally, you still need to provide a high availability, high reliability network connectivity to underpin it all.
Indeed. I have a view that a lot of these emerging brands, as I mentioned earlier, particularly the consulting partners, Infosys and Wipro and HCL and Tata Communications in particular, and certainly Tech Mahindra in a broader scale, although they're quite significantly larger than the rest. I think there's a lot of professional services demand here now where organizations from CEO down are having to be a lot smarter about where they're spending their money, a lot more nimble and agile about how they're deploying and implementing solutions. They're also having to do Lego block solutions where they may fix a problem once somewhere with a piece of network capability and be able to then redeploy that in multiple places to get multiple return on investment on this. And I think this is where potentially some of the very larger incumbents, certainly at the telco and carrier space, less so in the mobile network carrier space, because there's a big difference between a mobile carrier and I guess a fixed landline and data center player. But they often operate at slightly slower scale because they've got a larger, amount of sunk cost in infrastructure, and they look at longer term return on investments up to 15 years. But if you're a mine or a manufacturing plant or an engineering firm in some way, you cannot afford a 15-year window on a return on investment. And I think there's also one other thing I'd love to get your thoughts on with regard to this that I'm seeing, and certainly with work we're doing in some of my own companies, is that these organizations now are looking for not just a quicker return on investment, but also a faster time to market. So they're looking to reduce that time to market, reduce the cost overall and capabilities that they may not have to bring those internally into the organization from external partners, So reduce that time to market and reduce the time to return on investment. I'd be keen to get your thoughts on where this is going to take us, not just in private networks, but also more interesting solutions, whether it's smarter cars and devices or just smarter infrastructure. And as you said earlier, different types of intelligent sensors with or without machine learning and AI being deployed into environments where not just 15-minute smart cities, but just cars that do better things other than just self-drive.
Well, I think you mentioned mining, and I've already seen some examples where mining companies are using sensors and private 5 or 5.5G networks in order to actually drive greater efficiencies and a greater automation. I think we're yet to see an enormous amount of AI overlay on top of that, but I think that's coming. But again, it's going to be areas where we have a high proliferation or potential proliferation of IoT devices, where we're going to see a lot of these private networks go to the fore. And I think you were talking about ROI. I think if we're talking about a private network with a large array of IoT devices, a lot of intelligence on the ground, automation, I think you're looking at a far quicker ROI than you would on the carrier scale, where they're having to invest in massive networks, massive rollouts. I think undoubtedly they're headed in the direction of 5.5G and 6G beyond, and I think it's going to provide an enormous net benefit. But I think it's going to be, as always with carriers, it's going to be a large deployment phase, a massive investment, and obviously the carriers need to recoup that investment with a deployment cycle of services that they're going to get from their clients, the solutions on the ground, and anything that they can do with ancillary services around cloud and other things to enhance the level of deployment, the level of uptake, the level of value that their clients are realizing from these new technologies, I think is going to be evident as we see some of the rollouts and some of the use cases in the year ahead.
Yeah, and let's wrap up with one final point if we can. Telcos are challenged, as are any organisation, with the general cybersecurity issue, and we've seen a few very big incidents. Certainly here in Australia, where we're no strangers to it. Three of our major carriers, and certainly our second largest, have suffered massive cybersecurity incidents. In one case, essentially their entire customer base, both business and consumer. Our largest carriers had a massive incident where all of the staff data was removed, and another one had a smaller incident, but significantly more criticality because it was essentially all of the payment data. And you touched on Huawei's SDB, and I believe from memory, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they've achieved the common criteria evaluation assurance level 4 from memory, or 4 plus. Which is essentially a highly secure source code and above certification. I'm keen for us to go back and forth a little on this challenge of sort of protecting the networks from a physical environment. We've seen a few incidences where people have driven things like camper vans outside a data center and blown themselves up and taken infrastructure out. We've seen nations take other nations on in cybersecurity hacks and take down infrastructure, whether it's power and telco utilities. But from an operational point of view, it's increasingly easier for devices on the network, be it a consumer handset or a staff device like a laptop, to bring things into the network. So from the database upwards and from the storage and network upward, these are things that now need to be baked in. There was a lot of talk about security in general from a physical and virtual point of view. I think there's a lot of highlighting and reiterating the existing security capabilities that some of the carrier infrastructure and the networks, and certainly the mobile networks, had. One thing I didn't see, though, was a lot of focus on application and data level assurance and governance compliance with both cybersecurity and privacy. And I think more now than ever. I know that's a fairly silly thing to say sometimes because it constantly increases over time. But with the European Union's GDPR compliance becoming more powerful, with bigger and bigger fines being issued to some of the social media networks and the cloud platform providers in the public cloud space, I'd be very keen to get your take on two elements. But let's just start around cybersecurity as general, and then I'd like to come back to you with a couple of questions around data privacy and compliance and governance.
I think, Des, you were right to mention there some of the certifications. I think certainly Huawei are under an enhanced level of scrutiny here and are seeking to do everything they can to provide the certifications and the assurance to their clients. But I think on a general level, and aside from the network failures that we saw that major carrier in the US, there is always the risk of some sort of calamity, be it either an accident or some sort of malicious activity. I mean, we saw with OVH Cloud in Europe a year or two ago when they had an entire data center burned to the ground, only for a number of their clients who had assumed that they had backup and recovery included as part of their service, only to find out that there wasn't, and all of their data had been entirely lost, which had a critical impact on many organizations. This brought home to a lot of organizations not only the need to ensure that you have adequate levels of security and protection, and it goes beyond just protection and detection right through to having the backups, having the recovery, having the incident response capability, because one of the adages that I focus on here is the fact that you're never going to be able to predict where a cyber incident or some sort of other disaster is going to occur. They're happening all the time, and if we could predict them, we prevent them all. But the reality is you don't necessarily want to invest in prediction because you're never going to be able to predict what's going to happen. Instead, you want to invest in preparedness, to be able to respond to an emergency, to get things back up, to ensure that your cyber security and cyber hygiene is as rigorous as possible, but also that you have the capability to recover and have the preparedness and the nimbleness to be able to act in terms of any type of incident. But I don't think the whole cybersecurity challenge is going to go away anytime soon. I think we're somewhat hampered, certainly in the US, by the fact that the complete gridlock in Congress has prevented them from bringing forward any sort of real federal level privacy regulation. We're seeing the SEC step in with regulations that are focused on companies and breach reporting. But we really need a common standard in the US at a federal level for privacy and security, a bit like we have for GDPR in Europe, because the sort of patchwork that we have of different states is providing an enormously complex overhead for any organizations operating in that region.
Indeed. Now, on the topic of privacy, there's been some very big announcements of late, and I think it was the end of February, around about the 25th, 26th, there was an announcement that came out of NTT Docomo, Japan's leading mobile operator. They have about 89 or 90 million subscribers last time I looked. And they announced that they've selected Amazon's Web Services environment to deploy a nationwide 5G Open Radio Access Network, or 5G ORAN. And this is not necessarily a new approach, what we would normally call public cloud versus private environments, telco clouds that are run by the carriers themselves. This is a great idea in a commercial sense because it's an easy, fast, rapid, low-cost way to deploy into infrastructure that may not exist in your own telco cloud. One thing that really struck out me, though, was the announcement was very light on some of the strategic and I guess, deployment roadmap around some of the governance compliance that would be needed. And Japan's no stranger to data privacy. They are one of the leading players in the world, giving Australia and Germany a run for their money. But I think it's going to be an interesting
can I just finish
success story if it's done well, but also an interesting challenge if it's not done well, in that moving data into a public cloud for a very significant part of your telco infrastructure, particularly 5G radio network infrastructure to manage in the operating support services, or OSS, in the network. There's a lot of data moving through that, and if you're taking it out of your private networks in the telco space into a very public network environment where, albeit capable of being just as secure, not necessarily the same number of nines, there's a bunch of other interesting challenges of moving data in and out of those environments and logging that, tracking it, controlling it, and securing it. And I'm keen to get your thoughts on kind of how this plays into what we might see elsewhere, where there's probably been a bit of reluctance to put that level of critical infrastructure into a public cloud, regardless of whether it's Amazon's or Microsoft's or anyone else, given the sensitivity of the data will be going in and out of the network and across it, particularly ORAN, where the data will be traversing that public cloud in and out of devices and handsets. I don't know that we have yet on a global level or national level within governments got the data privacy structures in place for full regulation to describe ways and means that should be done properly, other than complying with existing data privacy challenges. What's your take on this whole thing of telcos, particularly the likes of NTT Docomo, moving the mobile networks ORAN environment into a public cloud, whereas normally it would be behind very different and more stringently secure environments in their telco cloud they run privately or outsource to a third party that operates on their behalf?
I think this goes back to what we were saying with that major outage that we saw in the US. One of the things that we need to focus on is the fact that telcos have always run to a higher level of reliability than we traditionally see in the cloud. And I'm not sure that public cloud is quite there yet in terms of reaching the same level of reliability, but maybe we're entering that environment. One of the things that I saw in the last week that has been of particular interest to me is the fact that Google have announced that they're dropping egress charges, and we're talking about taking data in and out of these environments. Egress and a lot of the charges that have been stacked on some of the cloud provisions have made the cloud environments prohibitively expensive if you become too reliant on them. And I think many of the telcos, many of the large players are certainly still convinced that they can provide better value and greater reliability in their own environments. It's different if you're a new player. If you're a new player and you want to sort of break into a market, then you can rely on such as public cloud infrastructure to provide you with a stepping stone in order to get into that environment. be interested to see how they fare in terms of reliability and overall cost in the long term. But I think this is a space we're going to watch. So, Des, I think we're going to be back soon with follow-up programs to pursue a lot of these issues and to share some of our thoughts. Mobile World Congress it's now behind us. We're looking ahead. There will be many announcements in the weeks ahead, and I look forward to picking up the discussion and bringing some of these issues to our audience here as frequently as we're able.
Indeed, Bill. And for our audience, we would love you to join us on whichever platform you choose, LinkedIn, some of our LinkedIn groups, Facebook Business, Twitter, of course. Ping us directly. We'll have details wherever you see this video with the description and whatnot of the show itself, where you can click to links and follow Bill or myself on those social platforms, or reach out to us via in-mails on LinkedIn or DMs on Twitter, or however you feel. Send us your questions, send us your feedback. We'd love you to join that conversation. And if you and your organization would like to join us at the desk here to have a discussion around some of these topics, we would love to invite you to the desk as well and bring you into the conversation as we go week by week, month by month. But just quickly to wrap up that data privacy challenge, Bill, I think the big thing I want a lot of our audience to think about when they're in this space, particularly those in the carrier space, and those looking at building applications and business solutions into this space, is that there's a very big difference between a very tightly controlled environment that's in a telco cloud, often very physical infrastructure, to what they may not have a lot of experience with, despite what they think they use in their enterprise systems with public cloud. There's a very big difference to something being stood up and run in a zone, in a region in Japan that may have a need to fail over and end up being in a completely different country where the laws and regulatory compliances are very, very different. They may be more or less stringent. So I think that's a key takeaway I'd like our audience to ponder from their boardrooms and downwards, and also put to us questions that they may have around this, and potentially we can bring them to the desk when we regroup again. But Bill, it's been great to see you. Thanks for your time. And for our audience, thanks for tuning in again.
It's been a real delight, Des, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion. We've covered Mobile World Congress today. I'm keen to follow up on many of the points you've made around security, not only for the telco environment, which we've been focusing on today, but also the wider business and technology environment. Hopefully we'll be able to focus on bringing guests onto the show if they have major announcements or would like to enter into discussion with us. But we'll also be picking up on social media platforms. Follow the news on Elnion.com, where we'll be publishing regular articles on many of these topics. And we look forward to engaging with you all soon. Des, thanks for your time, and everyone else out there who's listening, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Bill.